Two suspected suicide bombings rock a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut, killing dozens and injuring at least 180 people. Iraqi Kurdish forces launched an offensive to retake Sinjar from Islamic State militants, with the initial focus on cutting the supply route between the Iraqi city of Mosul and Syria. And Sweden introduces temporary border checks to control the flow of migrants, as EU leaders agree at a Malta summit to a €1.8 billion fund to help African countries. Good evening and welcome to the news today. I'm Marav Savir. We begin our coverage in Lebanon, where two massive explosions rocked a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut this afternoon in a suspected suicide attack. At least 37 people were killed, and the number is expected to rise, with as many 180 people injured. The blasts occurred in the Burj al-Barajneh neighborhood in the capital's Dakhia quarter. And joining me in studio now are I-24 News Middle East senior analyst Ali Waqid and I-24 News military correspondent Shai Ben Ali. Ali, I want to start with you. What new information do we have from Beirut?
Well, the new information is that Hezbollah is already saying that the suicide bombers might be Syrian refugees that succeeded to infiltrate the country recently, and that the number is expected to raise because it was it was the rush hour of Thursday evening in Beirut, in this stronghold of Hezbollah, where the people were preparing the weekend off and a holiday of Friday, and the markets were full when this happened. According to one version, the second, which we don't have yet a confirmation, the second suicide bomber exploded himself when he saw the security men of Hezbollah arriving to the region. Hezbollah is now in search of a third suspected person that some witnesses say they saw him running away from the region after the second explosion. But it is a very strong hit that Hezbollah security system receives this evening after months of relatively calm period in this region of the Shiite community in the Lebanese capital.
And you mentioned Syrian refugees, and this is when the blame game does begin. Is there any idea of whether any extremist group, we're talking the Islamic State, may claim responsibility for this?
For the moment, there is no official claim of responsibility, but we can easily expect that this might be the Al-Nusra Front or the Islamic State. Hezbollah has, at least in the, especially recently in the last month and weeks, a long bill to settle with the jihadist group. Hezbollah is deeply implicated in the Syrian crisis. In the last weeks, Hezbollah with the regime are succeeding to retake cities and towns and villages from the hands of Al-Nusra and the Islamic State. And I think after the taking of control of the Aleppo airport, this is, in my opinion, the most symbolic retaliation that the jihadist group could have gave back to Hezbollah.
And Shai, you still want to?
Right. It also fits a certain pattern. IS has made it almost a tradition. Whenever it suffers any sort of setback, it knows very well, and it's practiced this. It immediately strikes back, not necessarily in the same area. This could very well have something to do with the advances by the Syrian regime and its Hezbollah allies in the area of Aleppo yesterday and the day before. And this could be very well a strike back. IS is very media in tuned. It always takes these things into consideration, and often the reaction doesn't even happen in the geographic area of the setback. But this could very well be related to what we're seeing in Syria.
And it's been about a year since the last attack in this area. What does this mean for Hezbollah and Nasrallah? And this is a big blow. We're saying already 37, some sources already saying over 40 people killed, 180 injured.
Yeah, it says that no matter what are the measures, the security measures that Hezbollah is taking, when there is a decision from the Islamic State to strike in the Hezbollah strongholds, at the end of the day they will succeed. It is true that we are not seeing the frequency of attacks like we knew in the last month, and the fact that the Ashura, very symbolic and very important holiday of the Shiite community, passed without any special incidents, any terror attack, was a very big achievement of Hezbollah, because hundreds of thousands of people were gathered to celebrate celebrate the ceremonies and the festivities of the Ashura, and came today after Hezbollah diffuse some confidence that is succeeding on the internal front to stabilize the situation, to stabilize its strongholds, and on the other hand, it was succeeding in the Syrian conflict to help the Syrian regime to take important and strategic areas, but yet some local incident might explain to everybody that this circle of violence is far from coming to its end.
And also they have very strong presence in Syria, the Syrian civil war. What does this mean for them in regards to Syria?
I think they're entangled there. I don't think their presence, despite certain reports a few months ago that perhaps Hezbollah was maybe thinking of getting out of that, I think they're well mired in that whole struggle. You know, despite certain advances by the regime is still very much under pressure there. It is an Iranian interest, it is a Shiite interest, it is a Hezbollah interest to prop up that regime, along with certain help from Russians, from the Iranians, and I think they are entangled there. This, in terms of a realist outlook at the region, you could say it works in Israel's favor, for example, that Hezbollah is entangled in this mess. I don't think they have too much time or ability to worry with other problems.
And of course, entangled in this Syria mess is the Islamic State. Its name also may be being thrown around with this attack in Lebanon. But today, Kurdish forces backed by U.S. airstrikes captured several villages in an offensive launched to retake the Iraqi town of Sinjar from IS. The terror group overran Sinjar last year, in the process killing and enslaving thousands of Yazidis, which focused the international spotlight on the IS's violent campaign. Shai Ben-Ari, our military correspondent, has the story.
A military convoy in the early morning hours on its way to join an offensive to liberate the northern Iraqi town of Sinjar from the Islamic State terror group.
Today, it's our duty to liberate Sinjar from injustice. This is the duty of every Kurdish citizen, and this is what President Masoud Barzani told us to do. We are fully prepared to attack Sinjar and liberate it soon, God willing, to help its people return back to their homes.
The attack was launched around 6:30 a.m. local time. By the afternoon, a force of 7,500, including Peshmerga and PKK fighters, over 1,000 Yazidi recruits, and Kurdish special forces, had begun clearing Sinjar neighborhoods of IS militants. Some 600 were believed to be occupying the town. Earlier, 3 surrounding villages were captured after heavy fighting, as well as a section of nearby Highway 47.
Sinjar sits astride Highway 47, which is a key and critical resupply route for the enemy. This is the primary road between Mosul and Raqqa, ISIS' 2 primary capitals here. And by seizing Sinjar, we'll be able to cut that line of communication, which we believe will constrict ISIL's ability to resupply themselves, and is a critical first step in the eventual liberation of Mosul.
The offensive is being aided by U.S.-led coalition airstrikes, which military officials say have killed 60 to 70 IS jihadists so far. Strikes are being called in by American military specialists on the ground. U.S. Special Forces are also embedded with the Kurdish fighters. Pentagon officials say they are serving in advisory roles and are not taking part in the actual fighting. The capture of Sinjar by Islamic State terrorists in August of 2014 was a seminal moment. Estimates are that between 2,000 and 5,000 Yazidi men were executed during and after the town's fall, with thousands of Yazidi women taken captive.
They started to divide women amongst themselves, with each emir, whose job is to kill and cut off heads, taking 4 women. The emir has the right to sell, buy, or exchange women with his friends when he feels bored with them.
The offensive, dubbed simply Operation Free Sinjar, is still ongoing.
Shai, as you said, the operation itself still continuing, and we're getting details as it progresses about what exactly is going on. And as you mentioned in the report, there are mixed reports suggesting that American special forces are taking part, others saying that they're staying out of the actual fighting itself. Right.
The official Pentagon position is that these fighters, these U.S. special ops, are in an advisory capacity. This could be something of a smokescreen, though. You know, last month there was a raid by special Kurdish forces near Kirkuk, which rescued about 70 hostages. The official position was the same also, that U.S. commandos were present, taking part in an advisory capacity. But of course, a U.S. special op was actually killed during that operation, Master Sergeant Josh Wheeler. And it has to be said, when you are in an advisory capacity, you usually don't get shot. So this could be a very careful sort of smokescreen that the Americans are using to hide, to not commit themselves too much to these efforts. But we are seeing a very interesting presence of U.S. Special Operation Forces in these kinds of operations.
And can this be connected at all to the U.S. pushing the Kurds in Syria also to be more involved in the fighting?
I'm not sure for the moment, because we should take into consideration the Turkish calculations regarding the Kurds. But there is no doubt, Mirav, that the fact that this battle on Sinjar started very well for the Kurds. On the other hand, the Iraqi army is preparing a counteroffensive in the Ramadi region. Plus what is happening in Aleppo, we are seeing that this is a momentum that goes against the Islamic State, and we should wait to see whether they will manage to deal with several attacks in several fronts. That at the beginning they are cutting the two strongholds in Iraq and in Syria, Raqqa and Mosul, and this is maybe the first military challenge that the Islamic State will face, and it would be very much interesting to see how they will deal with this. When you cut the 47 road, you cut the supply of arms, of fighters, and of oil cells, which mean the incomes of the organization will become lower. And there's so much talk about Sinjar being a strategic point, a strategic town. Why has it mainly been left out of the headlines since this pivotal part of the fighting against ISIS and the U.S. beginning to launch its airstrikes over a year ago?
This was basically delayed because of infighting between the various factions. As was mentioned in the piece, there's about more than 7,000 forces on the ground in this fight for Sinjar. They represent PKK forces. They represent primarily Peshmerga forces, also Yazidi recruits who are basically really urging to get into Sinjar to really rescue the people there and to liberate their town. The idea is that there are basically tensions here. The Yazidis have a lot of anger towards the Peshmerga. Basically, they see them as responsible for the initial failure, for the initial fall of the town. There's a lot of blame going on there, and a lot of them actually side with the PKK, which is another Kurdish organization. There's some tension between them. So basically, all these tensions caused a lot of delay in the planning, and that's why it took over a year just to launch this operation.
Shaiban Ali Waqid, thank you very much for joining us. And Haaretz daily newspaper sponsored its second annual peace conference today in Tel Aviv, where, not surprisingly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict took center stage. Here's what a few of the participants had to say.
I would like to say today that whatever the challenges and whatever the difficulties, it is in Israel's interest, in the region's interest, in the global interest, for there to be peace. And however difficult it is, we must never stop striving for peace.
And just an hour ago, a senior member of the cabinet of Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Levin, said that the two-state solution is out. It's finished. So if I were an American analyst sitting in Washington to try and to discern what is the real policy of Israel on the two-state solution, when the Prime Minister says one thing, as he's also Minister of Foreign Affairs, his Deputy Foreign Minister says the opposite. A leading minister, Mr. Levin, says the opposite. I would reach the conclusion that I have no possibility of reaching a real assessment of what Israeli policy is.
And joining us now is Professor Emmanuel Navon of the International Relations Program at Tel Aviv University. Good evening.
Good evening.
Now, Professor, this comes in the wake of the EU officially announcing that they will label products made in Jewish settlements in the West Bank and the Golan Heights. We're hearing so much of a push for this diplomatic dialogue. Is this all a war of words that's going on with the labeling, or is this actually something that's going to affect the Israeli economy and push it to the table?
Well, I do not think that this labeling is going to affect the Israeli economy. It only affects less than 1% of Israeli exports to Europe. And we're talking mostly about agricultural and low added value industrial products. Also, they can still be sold and exported to Europe. They just won't benefit from the trade agreement between Israel and Europe. So, no, it will not affect the Israeli economy. It is more a symbolical decision, which, by the way, is consistent with Europe's policy vis-à-vis Israel. It might not be consistent with Europe's policy to other disputed territories in the world, but Europe has always declared, when it signed its agreements with Israel, that it does not recognize Israel's sovereignty beyond the armistice lines of 1949.
So if it's not actually going to be effective in crippling the Israeli economy, what's the big fuss? What is the EU going to gain from this? Is Israel really going to be pushed to actually join dialogues again? Or this is very one-sided. We're hearing the Israeli Prime Minister speak out against it, the World Jewish Congress speak out against it. What is this doing?
I don't think it's going to achieve anything in terms of trying to push the sides in negotiating an agreement. But I think it's just going to alienate Israelis who would be willing to start a dialogue again, because when they look at Europe's policy, they just wonder why Europe doesn't label goods imported from, for example, northern Cyprus. Cyprus is a member of the European Union. It has been occupied, the northern part of Cyprus has been occupied by Turkey since 1974. Europe doesn't label products coming, for example, from Western Sahara, which has been occupied by Morocco since 1975. So this lack of consistency, I think, is making a lot of Israelis wonder what the whole story is about.
So why just label products and not push sanctions on Israel like the European Union has done in the past with other countries?
Well, first of all, the boycott in Europe has been declared illegal by Europe's highest courts. For example, the Supreme Court in the UK and France's highest court of justice also have declared that the boycott of Israeli products is, and boycott in general, is illegal. Also, that would expose the EU to sanctions, possibly at the World Trade Organization. Israel, as a member of the World Trade Organization, could basically ask the organization for an arbitration. So boycott has been declared illegal by European courts. It would expose Europe to legal troubles at the World Trade Organization, so I don't think it's on the cards.
And London mayor who's visiting the region also got in a little bit of trouble for comments he made about boycotts and the BDS movement being misguided.
Well, I think that when he came to Israel and he saw the reality of Israel, you know, he realized the amount of nonsense that is being said in the UK about Israel, completely disconnected from reality. And he came to see, I think, he came to realize that this conflict is complicated, and you certainly don't solve it by labeling products or declaring boycotts only on one side, because a conflict is between two sides.
Emmanuel Navon, Professor of International Relations at Tel Aviv University, thank you for joining us this evening on the latest from the labeling products of the European Union. As we were saying, a peace conference today here in Tel Aviv, and Eli Hochenberg, our diplomatic correspondent for the News Today, had the opportunity to sit down with Martin Indyk, who served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations while she was there. Here's the interview.
Mr. Indyk, thank you very much for being here with us.
My pleasure.
So just earlier this week, we've seen what the Israeli Premier Netanyahu described as the best meeting ever with the U.S. President Obama. But it seems that the main objective of this meeting was to try to keep the past in the past, or at least make it look like it. What's your input on this meeting?
I do think it was an effort by both leaders to turn the page. And I think that's very important, because the U.S.-Israel relationship came under a great deal of strain because of the way that the Prime Minister decided to conduct his campaign against the President of the United States. It was unprecedented. It created a very awkward situation for democratic supporters of Israel and Jewish supporters of Israel, having to choose between their support for Israel and their support for their president. But let's hope that we can move on and that the United States and Israel can, as both leaders agreed to do, focus on the common threats that Israel and the United States face in a very difficult time in the Middle East.
Well, in this respect, many described the Netanyahu-Obama summit as a fence-mending meeting, but maybe more importantly, it was a fence-mending meeting between Netanyahu and the American Jewish community, which was, needless to say, very frustrated in the last couple of months from the occurrences over the Iran deal. Do you think there's a severe damage in the relations between the American Jewish community and Israel for the long run?
No, I think the American Jewish community will be very relieved by the message that Prime Minister Netanyahu brought, not just on the issues of his relationship with the President of the United States, with their president, but also on the message about the way in which Reform and conservative Jews, the vast majority of American Jews, are welcome as part of the community of Israel. So I think that too was a welcome message. But we'll have to see how things progress. There is a troubling trend amongst young Jewish people and amongst Democrats as well, that it is creating, I think, a real concern. Should be a concern for the government of Israel too, that they're losing support. The trend lines are moving in the wrong direction, and that does relate to the question of Israel's posture towards the Palestinians.
Yes, well, another important message by Netanyahu in his visit to Washington was his commitment to the two-state solution. But if we look at the current reality, we see a very hawkish right-wing government here in Israel. We see many problems within the Palestinians between Fatah and Hamas. And some U.S. advisors themselves said that the White House does not see any prospects for renewing the peace talks until 2017.
Right, but that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. Unfortunately, there's a government in Israel whose the majority, I think, of the members do not support a two-state solution. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think in reality that's the case. So it's good that the Prime Minister is committed to it, but he's formed a government that can't follow through on it. And it does take two to tango. Yes, the Palestinians are engaged in terrible, horrendous acts of violence. That should stop. It's unacceptable. And the incitement also needs to stop. But there are things that Israel can do as well to help in that process. I think that's what President Obama wanted to hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu. And there's a real problem on the ground here beyond the issue of Palestinian violence, terrorism and incitement. And that is that there is a process of creeping annexation of the sea areas of the West Bank, the 60% of the West Bank that Israel still holds. And it's fine to say, oh, there's a settlement freeze. There's no settlement freeze in terms of the construction that is going on. There's an announcement freeze, but there's massive construction going on. And there's demolition of Palestinian structures in the sea areas. And there's legalizing of illegal outposts, which is expanding the footprint of the settlements beyond the barrier. And all of that is creating a reality on the ground that really throws into question whether there is still a possibility of a two-state solution, as opposed to what begins to look like a one-and-a-half-state solution, which will never be acceptable to the Palestinians. So there are all sorts of things that could be done on the ground to reverse that process. And it doesn't take a cabinet decision to do it. It's within the hands of the defense minister. And I think that's what President Obama is looking to Prime Minister Netanyahu to do.
Do you think the White House, to a certain extent, has given up on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or its solution?
No, I don't think that at all that President Obama has given up because he believes very strongly that if you give up on trying to achieve a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you in effect condemn Israel to a future like its present, or worse, in which there is no hope for a separation between Israelis and Palestinians and a secure peace for Israel. So I don't think that he will give up. And certainly Secretary of State Kerry will not give up. But the question is, what can be done now. And I think the most important thing to be done now is to preserve the two-state solution, to reverse this process of creeping annexation, to find a way to bring Arab states who also want to see a resolution of this conflict into the process, but they'll only do it if they see that there's a government in Israel committed to it. And then the United States can help that process. There's an international community out there that wants to support that process. So there's a way of doing it from the ground up and from the outside in, and maybe that can change the circumstances in which eventually you can get back to negotiating.
And finally, if we're looking towards the future, the U.S. Elections, do you think the following administration, whether a Republican or a Democratic, will allow itself to keep the relations with Israel so shaky or doubtful?
Look, the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong. I worry about the longer-term trends, but it's strong. But the strength is based both on a security partnership, a strategic partnership, and a partnership in pursuing peace. The two go hand in hand. And it's very important that the people of Israel, in the first instance, and their government also be seen to be pursuing peace. To get caught trying, because that changes the environment. That's something the United States can get behind. But if it doesn't come from Israel, do not expect the United States to do it for you. We tried that. I tried that with Secretary of State Kerry. We gave it our best shot. We mobilized the U.S. government, the resources of the U.S. government, behind that effort. But our will alone was woefully inadequate in terms of getting the parties to an agreement. It has to come from both sides. And yes, there has to be a similar move on the Palestinian side, absolutely. But the failures and fecklessness of the Palestinians cannot be an excuse for Israel not to take actions on its own behalf in its own best interests. You say Abu Mazen is not a partner. He could become empowered as a partner tomorrow. Tomorrow, if you would freeze all settlement activity. But, you know, without some move on Israel's part, in the first instance, it doesn't get the credit for trying. And in the second instance, it does nothing to help try to build a partner on the Palestinian side. No. You can take your fate into your own hands. You do not have to be victims. You do not have to live by the sword alone. But it's in your hands.
Mr. Indyk, thank you very much for your insights and this interview for I-24 News. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we return to our top story this evening. Two massive explosions rocked a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut in suspected suicide attacks. As of right now, at least 37 people were killed and more than 180 were injured, and those numbers are expected to rise. The blasts occurred in the Ein Sikh neighborhood in the capital's Dakhia quarter. And we are going out for a short break, and then we'll be back with more of the news today. Two suspected suicide bombings rock a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut, killing dozens and injuring at least 180 people. Iraqi Kurdish forces launch an offensive to retake Sinjar from Islamic State militants, with the initial focus on cutting the supply route between the Iraqi city of Mosul and Syria. And Sweden introduces temporary border checks to control the flow of migrants as EU leaders agreed at a Malta summit to a €1.8 billion fund to help African countries. Good evening and welcome back to the news today. European leaders met for a second day in Malta to discuss the growing migrant crisis with their African counterparts. It comes as Sweden, which previously encouraged immigration to the country, introduced border controls to stem the flow of people. I-24 News reporter Uri Shapira with the story.
Europe is taking additional steps to resolve its migrant crisis as the situation continues to intensify. Officials gathered Thursday at the European African Summit in Malta to discuss the situation.
Saving Schengen is a race against time. and we are determined to win that race.
However, the divisions between African and European countries and even within the EU bloc remain wide. Though EU leaders offer their African counterparts 1.8 billion euros in aid, for some, it is not nearly enough.
It's not enough, 1.8 billion euros. It's far from being enough. The needs are enormous. That's why we're calling on other partners to participate in the setting up of trust funds. And beyond that, what we hope for, it's not only in the form of public development aid. We hope for reform in worldwide governance.
Meanwhile, Sweden is the latest country apparently shutting its doors to migrants. Stockholm announced Thursday it will impose temporary border controls and ask the EU to join its relocation plan, a program presented last October to distribute tens of thousands of migrants across the bloc's countries.
We can do this because when our authorities tell us we cannot guarantee the security and control over our borders, we need to listen to that.
The new actions taken by European countries are to some degree motivated by fear. In Calais, France, at least 26 police officers were injured during a three-night clashes which took place in the local refugee camp. And while some leaders have tried to avoid speaking about the threats the huge wave of migrants pose, others are speaking out loudly on the subject.
Those countries who think of themselves today as secure and protected within their borders must know that if they do nothing, then tomorrow they will no longer be able to act, and they will be hit in the bowels by the fire of terror.
The current crisis is considered the worst of its kind since the end of World War II, with most of the migrants fleeing wars in the Middle East. According to Eurostat, at least 750,000 migrants arrived by sea to Europe in 2015, with Germany as the preferred destiny. While plans are taking shape, no solution in sight, at least not for the near future.
And with us now is former Israeli ambassador to France, Daniel Sheck. Thank you for being with us, Ambassador. Evening. Let's start with the summit itself. This is the first time in a really long time that we're hearing about the African migrants coming over. We've become obsessed with the Middle East migrants and the Syrians who are coming over. We've kind of forgotten when they were the first who really took this treacherous journey through the Mediterranean.
And we had better not forget about them because they are the real long-term problem. Of course, right now everyone focuses on the sort of crisis migration of people fleeing war zones in the Middle East. But there are millions and millions and millions of dissatisfied people in Africa, people who are no longer willing to take the role of the poor people of the world. Once they used to not to like that role, but to accept it. Today, when they can watch on their phones how much of a better life they can get elsewhere, the pressure on the borders of the developed world are going to grow. And the summit, it's the right thing to do. But 1.2 or 1.3 billion euros, that is ridiculous. It's a drop in the sea.
Is that more of a bribe? One of the things that these trust funds, as they're calling it, are being used for is for them to combat what is causing this mass migration. Is this a bribe for them, the African countries, just to keep people there?
I think the sad observation is that it is much too little, and it is even more than that, much too late. 30 years ago, that's what would have had to be done in order to create a livable life in Africa. And it's not impossible. There is a surge of development in Africa, of growth now. But it is not the African countries themselves who are benefiting from it. It's Western companies who are draining again the resources of Africa. So if the Western world wants to, quote unquote, defend its borders against a flow of, let's put it this way, standard of living kind of migration, not refugees, then they have to pour many, many more billions into Africa.
Shifting gears to Europe itself, the countries taking in these migrants, how at risk is Schengen exactly, and how long until Germany starts closing their borders like Sweden is?
Well, it depends on the numbers. Germany never pretended that it can open-endedly receive more and more millions. Europe will receive close to 1 million refugees this year, probably the same number, if not more, next year. there will be a cap to it at some point. The capacity in such a brief period of time to accept so many people is just limited. So I can't give you a timeline when this is going to happen, but I think that
it's coming eventually.
Yeah, and the language of the leaders, including of Mrs. Merkel, is much more cautious than it used to be a few weeks and months ago.
Ambassador Sheikh, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And in further news from Europe, Greek police fired tear gas to disperse protesters hurling petrol bombs in central Athens today as thousands took to the streets to protest against EU and IMF-imposed austerity measures. It marks the first nationwide strike called by Greece's main public and private sector unions since leftist Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras came to power in January. Here's more.
Thousands of Greeks took to the streets today to protest austerity measures in the country's first major general strike since the government agreed to a bailout package with European creditors.
These measures that the government wants to pass are measures that will bury us.
The bailout review talks with the EU and IMF inspectors resumed Wednesday. And now, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras is facing his biggest domestic challenge since being re-elected in September. The protesters object to new rounds of tax hikes and pension cutbacks that the rescue package entails.
Right now, we Greek pensioners can't afford to live. Enough with cuts to our pensions and wages.
Some black-clad youth broke off from the march to hurl petrol bombs and stones. They also smashed shop windows near Parliament. Police responded by firing tear gas and detained rioters. Flights were grounded, hospitals ran on skeleton staff, ships were docked at port, and public offices stayed shut across the country. It is a clear-cut message by a disapproving public, one that Tsipras no doubt hears loud and clear.
And that was a report by I-24 News reporter Shani Nakhshani. And we are now joined by phone Natalie Savarikas, a journalist in Crete. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, great to be with you.
Natalie, the strikes today literally bringing ships, planes, public sectors to a standstill in Athens and across Greece.
Absolutely. You know, it's something that we've seen in the past years when Greeks want to voice their anger and make their position clear to the government. They essentially go to the streets and hold strikes. And that's what we saw the first major nationwide and general strike, to be formed since Alexis Tsipras, this left-wing leader, took the helm of power back in January and then got re-elected in September. The Greeks poured into the streets today. They wanted to show him that although voting him into power not that long ago, they are completely adamant that enough with the pain, enough with the cuts. And interestingly enough, Alexis Tsipras' own party, the Syriza party, a department within that one, the labor policy department, even it urged Greeks to pour into the street and show the European Union and the International Monetary Fund that they mean business and they do not want these measures to be imposed. So it was quite a tour de force, if you like, from the Prime Minister himself.
And Natalie, you already touched on my second questions. Members of Tsipras' Syriza party supporting the strike, telling people go out there, you're right. But as a government, what can they do? Do they just have to sit back and let this happen, or is there any action they can take to calm the situation?
Well, as far as Alexis Tsipras is concerned, his main priority here is to implement the measures ASAP. He knows and he himself believes that they're completely, against the very core of his policies. They will probably even stifle the economy much more. But his part now is he needs support from the European Union. He wants to stay in the European Union, so he will do whatever it takes to stay on course. And then he will deal with the economy and with the angry Greeks, because he says that if Greece were to leave the European currency, things would be far worse, and the country cannot afford to go bankrupt. So that's his main priority, because we came very close to the country going back over the summer, and that's a scenario he wants to avoid at all costs, even if that means thousands of Greeks pouring into the streets and those scenes of mayhem that we witnessed today in the streets of Athens.
And Natalie joining us on the phone from Crete. Thank you very much for these latest updates from Greece as thousands of people take to the streets striking against austerity measures. Meanwhile, Egypt stands to lose an estimated $280 million a month in the wake of Britain and Russia's decisions to suspend flights to the country after a plane crash in Sinai. I-24 News correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim takes a closer look at the looming economic impact.
The lights will not go out in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thus vowed Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, promising to do all he can to protect tourists visiting Sinai. His comments came during a visit to the popular Red Sea resort yesterday.
Once again, Egypt is safe and secure, and we welcome your citizens to come to Egypt. Come in peace and leave in peace. We will exert every effort to protect them.
The visit comes 12 days after the crash of a Russian plane in the peninsula, which killed 224 passengers, mostly Russians. Afterwards, thousands of tourists fled Egyptian resorts. Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack, leading to international criticism of Egypt's airport security, which is under heavy scrutiny.
Some Russian people think that it's not really good work of Egypt security system in airport, because nobody knows what happened in these airplanes who crashed.
The tragedy is already having a profound impact on the country's tourism industry, which was already struggling to recover from 5 years of instability following the revolution that deposed the Mubarak regime. Egypt had been attracting a fifth of the business from the lucrative Russian tourist market, with most people taking to the beaches of Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, Russian air travel to Egypt will be suspended for a few months.
Egypt is the best-selling destination now, and it is still peak season, and this is the closest, warmest, and most affordable destination. Therefore, naturally, the situation is very difficult.
Sharm el-Sheikh has long been a popular holiday destination for British tourists too. Close to 1 million UK citizens visit each year, bringing with them much-needed hard currency. But amid fears of further terrorist attacks, many have cancelled their reservations. It spells disaster for Egypt's economy, as tourism accounts for close to 3 million jobs in the country.
The sector has just gone through 5 very difficult years. The profits of people working in tourism and the sector as a whole have been exhausted. People were hoping that the coming period would be fruitful.
But in the wake of the crash, many Egyptians here are watching the tourists, along with their livelihoods, disappear.
And Mohammed now joins us in studio. And first of all, Mohammed, this isn't only affecting Sharm el-Sheikh, where the plane took off from in this plane crash just a few weeks ago, but this will overall affect the entire Egyptian economy.
Absolutely. This is a huge blow to the Egyptian economy. It seems that they can't get a break in 5 years. It's not only affecting the resorts on the Red Sea, but they're also affecting other locations within Egypt, mainly in the southern part of Egypt, Luxor and other pharaohs and pyramid locations where many Europeans and Americans bring their hard currency with them to spend it. We're not talking about a matter of a month or two. This has been going for way too long for Egypt to be able to continue with this kind of crashing with the economy for too long.
And it actually saw a spike in popularity after terror attacks in Tunisia, and they were just starting to make use of the money that's flowing in because of that.
Absolutely. Between what happened in Tunisia and between just trying to kind of revive the economy again and having some kind of security in Sinai, this plane crash is basically crashed the economy again, and no one knows when the Egyptian economy will, whether it will survive it and when it will become healthy again.
And Sharm el-Sheikh, but Cairo as well, tourism is going to be hit, the industry, and as you said in your report, so many jobs rely on tourism itself.
At least 3 million jobs in this sector itself. And the larger picture, Mirav, is how, President Sisi goes from one challenge to another. It started with the political challenge with the Brotherhood. Now he's facing a huge challenge in Egypt with this, with the economy that again it can't revive, and he's also facing challenges from within the sector of the population in Egypt that voted for him, that are now publicly criticizing his policies in Egypt.
And this plane crash actually highlighted two of these big issues that you just mentioned, not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but we're also seeing the branches of the Islamic State that are claiming responsibility for so many attacks in Sinai. And all that is plaguing President al-Sisi, even as he makes his trips to Russia to speak with President Putin, to the UK to speak with David Cameron.
He can't get a break. A few days ago, Egypt went through a very bad weather. The rain basically exposed the bad infrastructure in Egypt, where many Egyptians died because of the heavy rain. But also, again, we go back to the economy. We go back to arresting many journalists. He's trying to anyone who criticizes the government and anyone who criticizes President Sisi may be at danger of being arrested.
But there's so much focus being put on the bad economy and terrorism that you sort of see these other issues, the infrastructure, the journalists. We had the Al Jazeera case that took headlines for several weeks, but it's largely being ignored now because so much pressure is being put on terrorism and fighting terrorism.
Terrorism affects the economy directly. So if Egypt cannot handle terrorism, and mainly in the Sinai Peninsula, its economy will never becomes healthy again.
Mohammed Al-Qasim, thank you very much for joining us. And this year's Fuel Choices Summit in Tel Aviv drew attention from all over the world. I-24 News economy correspondent Daniel Roth attended the event.
In a region whose long history of violence has been fueled by oil, Israel has set out to build a forum for R&D into alternative fuels. The Fuel Choices Initiative is an Israeli government project aimed at seeking out alternatives to oil over 10 years, specifically in the realm of transportation. And this year, the Fuel Choices Summit was drawing attention from all around the world.
So we have here people all the way from Japan to Canada, Brazil, Mexico. And we have here experts, researchers, entrepreneurs, governments, NGOs.
Can your product go?
The conversation was a draw for U.S. Secretary for the Department of Transportation, Anthony Fox, who sees this as an inspirational forum.
There's so many great ideas that we're seeing here, whether they're ideas of alternative fuel inputs into automobiles, or even saw a new wheel. Everybody says don't reinvent the wheel, but actually someone did. And I think these innovations are examples of what happens when either by necessity or because there are needs that need to be met that are unmet. Individuals have the ability to come up with great ideas.
The conversations ran from topics such as the ecosystem of energy and mobility to emerging technologies and new business models, and provided ample space for networking.
The EcoMotion is a community for smart transportation. Our goal is to connect all the people in Israel and also bring people from around the world to connect around smart transportation.
The gathering at Tel Aviv's centrally located and recently renovated National Habima Theater wasn't just discussion, though. The public square was chock full of enterprising transporters seeking some time in the sun for onlookers to learn about the innovations at hand, from bamboo bikes to new electric cycles, and apps aimed at better planning like FanZone, which connects concert and sports event ticket holders.
We significantly reduce traffic congestion. It means that there are less cars, less pollution. More people have a more fun way to get to the event. It means that more people are coming, but there is a lot less traffic on the way there. So that's our little contribution.
Importantly, the Fuel Choices Initiative is a public venture aimed at cutting Israeli oil use by 60% over the next decade. It's a lofty goal, according to everyone involved, but the Minister of Environmental Protection says it's an important one.
As a government, we set up new targets to reduce the pollution in Israel and the greenhouse gas emissions as part of, the UN convention on December. And we set up targets that are not easy to meet with, but we believe that due to technology changes, we are going to do it.
At a time of great environmental risk and opportunity, this summit is bringing together new wheels, new fuels, and new ideas. This is Daniel Roth for I-24 News in Tel Aviv.
And with us now is Lionel Friedfeld, financial analyst. Good evening, Lionel.
Good evening, Mary.
Focus now on Mitsubishi. First flight of its regional jet in more than 70 years. Japan really looking to get back into that market.
Exactly, and actually Mitsubishi is giving proud, of Japan because, as you mentioned, for half century, they didn't manufacture any plane over there. They were suppliers of Boeing, of Airbus for many years, but this is the first time they're manufacturing the plane, and the plane is called MRG, which is Mitsubishi Regional Jet. Basically, it's a regional jet, so they're competing against Brazilian company like Embraer or Canadian company Bombardier. The plane will have in between 70 to 90 seats.
And manufacturing regional jets was stopped after World War II. We're talking about 70 years. Why did it take this long for Japan to become a player again?
I think, the defense, aerospace, and the civil aircraft industry is very technical. So they were a main supplier of Boeing and Airbus. You only have two large players in that field. But if you look back, maybe last month, China also announced that they're going to create a plane which is called C919, which actually is going to compete against A320. So not every country can build manufacturing and have capacities to do aircraft. So in terms of regional aircraft, Canada does, Brazil does, Japan now is able to do that, but they already announced they're going to build even larger plane, like a 100-seat plane.
And you already mentioned Brazilian companies, the Chinese getting into the game now. How long will it take for the Japanese to really become dominant and maybe even overtake their competitors?
I'm not sure they will become dominant. They have actually a very tight schedule. Next year, they're going to release the first plane, and they're going to release 120 planes per year for the next few years. And obviously, it will depend on, the cost of the plane. It will depend really on the characteristic of the plane. But I think the bright idea here is Japan is back in business, and Japan is back in the aviation business.
And of course, Mitsubishi, a very, very well-known company. Lionel, thank you for being with us.
Thank you much.
And commemorations are being held in the United Nations to mark 40 years since Chaim Herzog, then Israel's ambassador to the body, rebuked the General Assembly for adopting Resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism. On Wednesday night, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry delivered an impassioned speech in defense of Israel's right to exist.
Truth summons us and unites us in common action against anti-Semitism. But make no mistake, bigotry isn't just a matter of a threat to Israel or to the Jewish people. It is a danger to all religions and to all who believe in freedom. America's support for Israel's dream and Israel's security, that will never change. And that is why we stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel here at the United Nations and in every international forum. It's why we speak forcefully against efforts to delegitimize or unfairly target Israel for criticism or condemnation.
And with us now is Danny Swibel, I-24 News reporter for This Week in History. So what do we got, Danny?
All right, so on this November 15th, 1977, the Shah of Iran was on a visit to the United States, to Washington, D.C., and he was actually tear-gassed accidentally on the White House lawn.
And a lot has happened since then, maybe domino effect from that day.
A lot of people say that this was the beginning of bad omens that would follow the Shah until finally he was to fall. What had happened was he was here in the middle of a speech of Carter, and Carter was boasting about the close relations between the U.S. and Iran and saying how actually specifically that 30,000 Iranian students were enjoying their time in the United States. Well, thousands of these protesters, these students were protesting outside. They did get tear gassed, and it went into the Shah's eye. And this is ironic because a lot of people said that maybe the U.S. government perhaps did it deliberately because the relations were not as close as perhaps most people thought.
And what were the reactions to this tear gas, these pictures that probably became famous of him wiping off his eyes standing on the White House lawn? What were the reactions back in Iran?
I mean, it was definitely, it definitely shook the Shah's. People were already doubting if the Shah was going to stay in power at this point, but this actually started solidifying that he was actually fallible. 1 or 2 months later, Carter actually visited the Shah in Iran, and this is when Carter gave the speech that the Shah is an island of stability. Well, as we would see 2 years later, a perfect storm came together and the Shah was to fall on January 16, 1979. But people always look back at this one event and saying that was the start of people doubting the Shah and making people realize that he was human and he had a lot of issues in his way he running. Iran.
And this is a Shah that also enjoyed drinking his alcohol, so maybe not the only reason, but obviously something that really sticks in the mind of many.
It's funny you mention that, because that is also another thing, because, you know, the Shah upset a lot of different people in the society. That was one of the issues. He's toasting with alcohol. And there was a time in 1971 where he put together a big event commemorating the monarchy of Iran, and it is believed he spent $100 million. So he did a lot of things in his time to really isolate his people and make all the different elements of society come together to help want him to be out of Iran.
And today, Iran, are they looking back at this at all? Do they not care that this even happened? The Shah is just a thing of the past, and this is just a picture that is happening to resurface years later?
Well, this is the interesting thing, is that when you look at the Shah's mistakes, a lot of people say the U.S. over the course of this very strong long-term relationship, that the U.S. wasn't hard enough on Iran. So people are definitely looking back, saying the U.S. perhaps helped this leader be loose with his policies and be careless with the way he ran things.
And of course, we're still seeing these implications today, with the Iran nuclear deal, and everybody looking back, maybe Shah, over the years, what has happened between the U.S. relations with Iran. Maybe with this new deal getting a little bit better since then.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. People will definitely look back and see and try to make parallels to history. But either way, we definitely look at how policy is run and how, specifically, how the U.S., are they really looking and they have their eye on the prize? Are they aware of what's going on with some of their friends in the region? Are they aware of the forces that can maybe affect change? And
Well, Daniel Sobel, always a pleasure. And returning now to the top story this evening, 2 suspected suicide bombings ripped through a Hezbollah stronghold in southern Beirut. Numbers now, at least 41 people confirmed dead. More than 200 were injured. The blast occurred in the Ain Sheikh neighborhood in the capital's Dakhia quarter. And we are now going for a break. Stay tuned for this evening's headlines, and we'll be back in just a short while with more of the news today. And welcome back to the news today. It's now time for our weekly Israeli politics debate. And with us is Dov Lippman, former Knesset member for the Yesh Atid Party. Good evening, Dov. And Dr. Hani Zubida, political science at Yazili Valley Academic College. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And Hani, we're going to start with you. Once again, Culture and Sports Minister Miri Regev finding herself in the midst of controversy. This time calling Attorney General garbage in recorded tapes.
Well, not exactly garbage. She gave him the S word, but never mind. Well, Miri Regev has a problem. Miri Regev has a problem in her office. Almost every conversation she has is recorded and being sent outside. Something she either needs to stop saying these private words for private people, or just understand that they're all going to go public. Well, right now, I assume she can. I've heard worse things from more prominent politicians about the same advisor. I've heard people calling him very derogatory term names and so on and so forth. But the notion is that she is under crossfire and she needs to be careful. Now, I've heard today that the state controller, is going to check every nomination she had ever since she got into office, which is going to be a huge problem for her.
And Dov, I see you out of the corner of my eye, just waiting to get an answer.
Yeah, the truth is, I feel that harping on things that she said in conversations, I mean, if every one of us had every one of our phone calls recorded, we've all said things, whether in anger or not in anger, about people that we don't want the world to hear. Besides, I'd separate...
the Culture and Sports Minister, and she keeps finding herself in the midst of these controversies.
So that I agree with, and certainly if I was in the midst of those controversies and things that I kept saying were out there, I would obviously be more
Save those
guarded.
for your private phone calls.
Correct. Absolutely. If you know that that people are after you, you have to have some level of decision making of I'll be careful. But the nominations, I think, is the more important issue to focus on, where it's a culture in Israel which we're trying to get away from, and this comes to the fore again. I'm happy that it's going to be looked into. I'm happy that we live in a country where we don't accept it, and hopefully we get to a point where we don't continue with it.
And how deep is this with appointments that Miri Regev is making?
If I can be blunt, everybody done that. It is the culture here. People can say whatever they want. I'm a political scientist. I deal with public.
Why is that?
Because that's the culture in Israel.
It does go back to, Hani, when the country started as a small country, everyone knew each other, everyone helping each other. It goes back to that. It goes back to that.
It's Mapai's system of benefits. It's kind of like clientelism in the Middle East. But in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, it is well known that you have a very big boss and then you have his clients and he gives you perks. In Israel, it was the big politician who gave positions to his milieu. Now, the issue is not... it is still going on. Now, the question is whether we want to change the tradition or the pattern, or we want to crucify people.
But how much is Miri Regev actually pushing and giving these nominations that it helps her personally to get re-elected to the...
Everybody does it. It's the same all over the place.
And that's what I want to say. I feel when I see attacks on Likud, and I'm not here to defend the Likud, I'm not in the Likud, I think it's very unfair for people to say, it's the Likud machine. The other big party, Labor, it works exactly the same way. It's nominations. I will say, the parties that don't have the primaries, where there are issues with that also, we are spared from that. I was part of a party, which again, there's plenty of criticism.
Like Yesh Atid.
Correct, for not having primaries, but I can tell you there was no system of having to pay anyone back. We were able to govern without that. It's a give and take on each side.
Well, yeah, we have an issue. But unless each and every person in the state of Israel will become a part of a party and will vote in the primaries, which will nullify the power that these lords of primaries have, we'll keep on seeing that, or we'll change the culture of nominations.
So this time you can't really point the finger at Miri Regev herself. This is deeply rooted in our society and in our politics in Israel.
I agree, just with the caveat of, my gosh, she knows everyone's watching her. She knows she's in the public eye and continues the same type of behavior.
Also this week, chaotic scenes at the Parliament, the Knesset, and the Internal Affairs Committee hearing where MPs tried to stop the head of the far-right Lahava from speaking.
So I have to be honest with you, and obviously I'll speak for the record. Of course I'm against Lahava and the extremism and the incitement and the violence. But I do believe...
You're watching these images. This is getting physical in the middle of a Parliament meeting.
I do believe that these members of Parliament, and I'm going to criticize people who I worked with, did this for their own show. There's a police in Israel. There's a justice system. If he's violating laws, they will prosecute him. They called him to this meeting so they can make this show. The members of Meretz, some members of Labor, maybe they felt weak. They have to come out and show something, and that I think is wrong. Use the Knesset for that
likening
purpose.
it to the KKK.
Again, strong statements, but why bring the guy in front of the camera just for the sake of using the Knesset to show your people, look how strong we are against him? I'm against it.
If we're talking derogatory terms, I think what was said in that meeting was way over hills. Now, the thing is, they did not invite him. Bezalel Smotrich, who was he was nominated for this meeting only as the chair of that committee. He was the one who invited him.
From the Jewish Home Party.
Yes, he was the one who invited him. And then I do believe that I agree with Dov. They could have done a completely different thing. They could have just walked out and just protest in that way. But what happened is that the guy that we saw, Benzi Gopstein, uses a very specific tactics against these people, and he specifically targets Arabs. And what he did to Frej, I believe that if there was a different person sitting at the chairmanship of this meeting, he would have taken him and kicked him out of the Knesset.
And these images now obviously can be seen all around the world. What does this do to the Israeli left?
Well, the first thing is, as someone who sat in the Knesset, it's embarrassing to see an institution which I think is the seat of democracy. We're the only democracy in the Middle East.
And this also isn't the only time you see fistfights in parliaments. We've seen it all over the Middle East, also over Europe, that it kind of gets to this. But what does this mean specifically for the left, which everyone's still pushing for this dialogue?
We have to understand, this is a show. And Dov is saying that time and time again. This item is a show. The thing is Benzi Gopstein. Benzi Gopstein is on the verge of being outlawed. His entire organization, Lahava, will be outlawed eventually. It's going to take a few months, but he's going to be outlawed. The person is on the fringe of Israeli society. Nobody should relate to him seriously. And he said, next time I'll sit here as a parliament member. It's not going to happen. The thing is with the left people, that they kind of like forgot that they did what they're preaching against. And that's a major question here.
And it's also, I think, Mirav, I think it's the left in Israel is feeling weak. People in Israel are shifting. Listen, whenever there's a wave of terrorism, it obviously brings the country even further to the right in general. People don't want to hear anything about the left in general. And this is an opportunity to flex their muscles and try to show strength. And I think it just does damage to Israel, and it's not the place for it.
Frustration, yes. Frustration, weakness. They see that they're not coming up in the polls. I just saw a poll yesterday which was dire for the left, the Israeli left. They see Benjamin Netanyahu traveling back, meeting Obama, and all they have to face is Benzi Gopstein, so they're very bitter.
And you already brought us to our third topic, Benjamin Netanyahu going to Washington, speaking again of a two-state solution for two peoples. Naftali Bennett, Education Minister, coming out against what the Prime Minister is saying. The hope and the notion is fading.
Finally, we found Naftali. Naftali finally came out to the world and said what he thinks, because I do not remember Naftali Bennett saying anything during the last wave of terror. He literally disappeared. Benjamin Netanyahu flies to the United States, meets President Obama, and says, 2 states for 2 nations, this is the solution. Never mind, a day later he said, but Jerusalem, there's no solution, which means no 2 states. But the thing is, Benjamin Netanyahu is the only member in the Likud and the Jewish Home who ever referred to a 2-state solution. Nobody else did that.
And Naftali Bennett even going a step further and saying that it's absurd to form another Arab state that will become another Islamic outpost, really pushing to that far right.
And there's no doubt that even people in the center of Israel, there's a concern about a Palestinian state becoming a security threat to Israel. But we have to be cautious in how we say things, because people are not going to be listening to Netanyahu. They're going to be quoting Bennett. And that's what happens. Netanyahu can say what he wants in the Oval Office, but Bennett is what's going to be quoted all over the world, and that's what takes away everything from any message of we are seeking some kind of a solution.
There's this fear of a Palestinian state and what that could do to the security situation, and then you have U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry a couple weeks ago saying that this is what a one-state solution will look like, this wave of terror. So which is it?
So I think that I would appreciate it if we heard messages of we understand the security concerns, and the president is pretty good at giving that message. The Secretary of State maybe a little bit less, but that is the struggle of the state of Israel today, is on the one hand trying to resolve the conflict, on the other hand, how do we do that while preserving our security? But to suggest that the terrorism will end and somehow we'll have a warm and fuzzy peace only if the Palestinians have a state, I think that's also a little bit naive to say at this point in time.
And Hani, just going back to things that Bennett has said since Netanyahu's meeting at the White House, saying that Israel should not fear a harsh international response to any move that they make regarding a Palestinian state. What do you make of that?
I make of that Bennett is literally positioning himself right to the center of the Israeli political system, facing Netanyahu in the next election to the premier position. That's what Bennett's doing. Bennett is positioning himself, while Bibi is positioning himself left to the center, Bennett is positioning himself right to the center. I would urge everybody to look at Naftali Bennett. Within the next year, he's going to make few moves by adding people, by statements, positioning himself right there for the premier. He is looking for that position. And on the same note, Martin Indyk said today in Tel Aviv that there were a few Israeli prime ministers who were willing to give half Jerusalem, and Benjamin Netanyahu was one of them. So the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu said in Jerusalem that he will not give Jerusalem was somehow contradicted.
So everybody's preparing for the next elections. Naftali Bennett, Benjamin Netanyahu, Miri Regev, Dov Lippman, Hani Zwina, thank you very much for joining us for this week's Israeli Political Debate. And on to sports news. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an investigation into claims the country's athletes are part of a systematic doping program. It marks the first time the Russian leader spoke out since the World Anti-Doping Agency Independent Commission revealed its damning findings this week. Danny Swibel with the story.
After an independent investigation established by the World Anti-Doping Commission, or WADA, accused Russian athletes with the aid of officials of engaging in systematic and widespread doping on Monday, Russian Sports Minister Vitaly Mutko pledged his country would adopt new measures to clamp down.
We can change the quality of doping testing. We can move from quantity indicators to quality indicators. We can move from direct common doping tests to biological passports, which practically excludes any manipulations and immediately gets into ADAM's systems. Secondly, we want to seriously consider tightening administrative responsibility and maybe consider criminal responsibility.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his first comments since WADA leveled its accusations, said on Wednesday Russia would cooperate with all international organizations looking into these issues and that someone needed to take personal responsibility for the problem.
I asked the sports minister and all colleagues connected to sports in some way to pay the utmost attention to it. That's firstly. Secondly, we must carry out our own internal investigation and to ensure the most open, I want to stress this, the most open professional cooperation with international anti-doping structures.
The commission reportedly found a, quote, deeply rooted culture of cheating in Russian athletics with the support of the Russian state security system, charges that could see the sporting superpower banned from international athletics, including the 2016 Olympic Games, as well as past Olympic medals withdrawn from any Russian athlete named in the WADA report who is found guilty of doping.
And last but not least, joining us now is Jonathan Regev with the Sports News. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, evening.
And it feels as if it was just a couple weeks ago that we were covering the World Cup, but we're already getting back to the swing of things for the next one.
Yeah, as the World Cup in Russia, by the way, we just spoke of Russia. They're also hosting the next World Cup, and the qualifiers are already on, even though there are more than 2 years to go. And a huge match tonight in Buenos Aires, Argentina hosting Brazil. Whenever these two meet, it's a huge affair. This time especially
because...
What
we can think about with Brazil is how embarrassing it was for them against Germany back in the World Cup.
that famous, that famous 7-1. Argentina reached the final, but now after two matches in the qualifiers already, they have only 1 point. They have not scored. Leo Messi will again not play due to his injury, and other two big players in Argentina, Sergio Aguero and Carlos Tevez, are also out. Brazil is doing a little bit better. They lost their first match in Chile, but then they won their second match at home to Venezuela. But you know what? Regardless of the situation, whenever Argentina and Brazil face each other, it's a huge affair. This game is about 3 or 4 hours away. Certainly something to watch.
And I don't even have to ask because I know the answer, but who are you supporting?
Argentina! Dale!
That is the reaction we were looking for.
They have to play so much better than they did so far.
And Jonathan, moving on, England rugby team embarrassed on their home soil in the World Cup of Rugby. More disappointments coming along.
More disappointments, and someone has to pay the price. And this time it's the coach, Stuart Lancaster. He was the coach of England rugby team. So many expectations for them, but when you don't deliver, especially at home, you go away. So he basically did what people expected him to do and stepped down as national coach.
What does that mean for the team itself?
Well, it means that they acknowledge the fact that it was a huge disappointment. There are now 4 years to go until the next World Cup, and the Six Nations is in the summer. Someone else is going to come in. They were not bad, by the way. That game they lost to Wales, the game they lost to England, to Australia.
That's not what people remember.
Yes. And when you host the World Cup, you have to do better.
Never disappointing is the Guinness Book of World Records, and there are some interesting.
Yes, every couple of months you see some incredible new records, and look at this. This is the longest dog going on a skateboard in a human tunnel.
I would want to take part in that.
Yes, and there we see it's very, 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 very long.
It's never ending. You're just watching it, and it's going and going.
And the dog, basically, so he finished, his name is Otto, by the way, and it happened in Peru, and he succeeded. He is now Otto the dog is in the Guinness World Book of Records as he completed the mission, going all through that long tunnel.
Well, there's one thing Otto the dog can say that he's done that I haven't, and there's that.
Yes, he's in the Guinness World Book of Records. We have not done that, so he's far better than us.
Well, Jonathan Regev, thank you very much for joining us with this evening's sports news. But that's all for this edition of the News Today. I'm Marav Savir. Thank you for watching, and have a great evening.